Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my 56th video lecture. This is going to be a lecture on the Scandinavian influences on the English language. As I have already said that I have discussed with you regarding the evolution of the English language, about the semantic change, about the standardization of the English language, about the outgrowing gender bias, and then I have regarding the section C of the syllabus, I have discussed with you the Latin influence regarding the enrichment of the English language, various Latin loan words, and how English language was tremendously influenced by the Latin vocabulary. Today I will discuss about the Scandinavian influences in the English language. So let us begin. Hope you are all well and good, fine. I am Arindam Ghosh. As I have already introduced to you, I am an assistant professor in a college of Beautiful. So regarding the Scandinavian influence of the English language, we must say that the earliest influence on the English language is, of course, the Celtic influence, and then there occurs the influence of the Romans, as denoted in the Latin influence. The Roman influence began around 43 to 410 AD. And if we divide the history of the English language into various periods, then we will perhaps end up in dividing it into 4 to 5 periods. For example, Old English period from 450 to 1150, including the Norman conquest. And then, of course, after the Norman conquest, the Middle English period, beginning from 1150 to 1500, then early modern English period from 1500 to 1700, and then modern English period. So, Scandinavian influence will be there in the Old English period. It began around 8th century, somewhat the end of the 7th century and the beginning of the 8th century, and ended up around the 11th century. The Scandinavian influence is also known as the Viking Age. Viking means pirates, যারা জলদস্যু। তো তারা কিভাবে ইংল্যান্ডে এলো এবং তাদের ইনফ্লুয়েন্স প্রতিস্থাপিত করলো ইংল্যান্ডে, তারই স্টোরি হচ্ছে স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান ইনফ্লুয়েন্স। বাট লেট আস ফার্স্ট বিগিন উইথ হোয়াট ইজ Scandinavia, or what is the land of the Scandinavia. Let us begin with this definitional scope of Scandinavian history. So if we look into the map of the Europe, these three finger-like countries in the map of the Europe, Norway, Sweden and Denmark, and this is Finland. Many people also include Finland, but Norway, Denmark and Sweden is generally considered as the Scandinavia. So this from these three countries, people invaded England and they were known as Vikings. So the Viking Age lasted roughly from the middle of the 8th century to the beginning of the 11th century. Who were the Vikings? Vikings were basically the Germanic tribes of the Scandinavian Peninsula and Denmark. The reasons for their sudden attacks and voyages are unknown. So they were Germanic tribes, just like the Anglo-Saxons. Anglo-Saxons invaders, Angles, Saxons and Jews, who invaded Britain around the 4th to 5th centuries. They are also Germanic tribes, and Scandinavian people were also Germanic tribes. And hence there was great similarity, at least initial vocabulary were very similar, and they can communicate with one another. Okay, so these Germanic tribes of the Scandinavian Peninsula and Denmark, they came to Britain around the 8th century, and the reasons for their sudden attacks are unknown. It is possible that they were of economic and political nature. In their adventures, the Swedes established a kingdom in the Russia. Norwegians colonized the parts of the British Isles, the Faroes and the Iceland, and from there pushed on to the Greenland and the coasts of the Labrador and the Newfoundland. The Danes founded their dukedom of Normandy and finally conquered England. So Vikings conquered large areas of England, but were at last stopped by King Alfred of Wessex. He signed the Treaty of Wedmore in 878 AD. So he signed the Treaty of the Wedmore, King Alfred of Wessex, a very important historical event, with Gunthrum, the Viking leader, the Dane leader. And that particular treaty defined the boundary line running roughly from the Chester to London. চুক্তি হলো অ্যালফ্রেড দ্য কিং অফ ওয়েসেক্সের সঙ্গে ট্রেটি অফ ওয়েডমোরের মাধ্যমে গুনথ্রাম দ্য ভাইকিং লিডার তার সঙ্গে, এবং কথা হলো যে একটা বর্ডার লাইন ক্রিয়েটেড হবে ফ্রম চেস্টার টু লন্ডন, টু দ্য ইস্ট অফ হুইচ দ্য ভাইকিংস ওয়্যার টু রিমেন. In the east side, the Viking people will rule, and in this particular area where the Danish law and customs will be followed, this particular area is and will be known as Danelaw. So what is Danelaw? যদি পরীক্ষায় প্রশ্ন করে 2 নম্বরের, বলতে হবে যে Vikings signed a treaty with King Alfred of Wessex. The treaty is known as the Treaty of Wedmore. Alfred signed this treaty with Gunthrum, the Viking leader, and within this treaty a certain area which is the east of the London has been given to the Danish law, has been given to the Dane people, and in this particular area Dane law, the Danish law and customs will be prevailed. So in the beginning of the 11th century, the Vikings reached the pinnacle of their achievement. Cnut, the king of the Denmark, conquered the Norway England and obtained the throne of England. So Viking invasions led to an immigration wave from Scandinavia. Many people come from Scandinavia and settle in Great Britain. Although most of the new inhabitants were Danes, there were also Norwegians and Swedish. Many linguists actually considered the Scandinavian influence upon the English language as a very subliminal and subterranean influence. That is, it's difficult to recognize the influence. এতটাই ইনফ্লুয়েন্স ডোমেস্টিক লেভেলে হয়েছিল, সাধারণ বিভিন্ন শব্দাবলী এমন ঢুকে গিয়েছিল ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজের মধ্যে স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান, যেহেতু অ্যাংলো স্যাকশনস who are the creators of the English language and of course Viking people, তাদের নিজেদের ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজের অনেক সিমিলারিটি ছিল. They were both Germanic tribes. এর ফলে অনেক সময় it becomes difficult to recognize which influence is Anglo-Saxons or which influence is Scandinavian. So the two peoples, the English and the Scandinavian, they amalgamated. They very strongly amalgamated with one another, as described in A.C. Baugh's book. The Scandinavians intermarried with the English, adopted many of their customs and accepted Christianity. Not much is known about the relation of the two languages. In some places, the Scandinavian gave up their language early, and in some places, Norse were spoken as late as the 17th century. It were similar languages, so it is highly probable that the two may have been mutually intelligible to a limited extent, which made the process of the borrowing and adoption very easier. So this is the historical background of the Scandinavian invasion into Great Britain. Now, what we can say that Scandinavians greatly influenced the English vocabulary, particularly in its place names. For example, according to Baugh and the Cable, there were almost 600 places with names ending in by, such as Whitby, Grimsby. So this suffix by has been borrowed from Scandinavian. The Scandinavian word actually means farm or town. The word can also be seen in the by law or town law. And almost 300 place names end in the Scandinavian word thorp, that means village, like Althorp, Bishopsthorpe, Linthorpe. So Thorpe and by. And there are almost as much place names that contain the word Thwaite. Thwaite means an isolated piece of land. For example, Applethwaite, Langthwaite. Around 100 end in Toft. Toft means a piece of ground. For example, Brimtoft, Nortoft. তাহলে বুঝতেই পারছো প্রচুর স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান প্লেস নেমস স্পেসিফিক্যালি ব্রিটিশ ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজের মধ্যে অ্যামালগামেটেড হয়েছে. সো let us discuss a bit about the concept of the Danelaw. The incursions of the Danes into the England started around the end of the 8th century. As I have said, যে ডেনরা ইংল্যান্ডে ঢুকতে আরম্ভ করছে at the middle and the end of the 8th century, near about 790. And when the bands of the Norse marauders attacked and plundered the east coast and finally established a few settlements there. So they were basically Vikings in nature. They were pirates. They were marauders. They basically plundered the land. তারা ধ্বংস করতো, জায়গা দখল করতো, দস্যু ছিল, and created some few settlements. 100 years later, as the result of more sporadic attacks, these settlements became more numerous. অনেক বেশি সেটেলমেন্ট হতে আরম্ভ করলো. The Danes and the Norwegians, they spread beyond the east coast and penetrated a good way inland and began to harry the southern as well as the more northerly parts of the England. And then again, as I've said, the Treaty of the Wedmore, signed in 878, the treaty thereby defined the running line roughly from the Chester to London, to the east of which the foreigners were henceforth to remain. And this territory was to the subject of the Danish law and hence known as the Danelaw. As I've said, the amalgamation of the two races occurred greatly, and hence the two languages, the Anglo-Saxon language and the Scandinavian language, they merged with one another to a great extent. Now, let us discuss about the great similarity between the vocabularies of the two languages. The similarity between the Old English and the Old Norse. The Norse were the language of the Scandinavians, the Danes particularly. So Old Norse and the Old English, the similarity between these two languages was very great, as both the English and the Scandinavians were descended from the same Germanic stock. Naturally, an enormous number of words were then identical in the two languages, like man, wife, father, mother, wise, well, ill, over, under, come, sit, etc. So এই ওয়ার্ডগুলো অলরেডি ম্যান, ওয়াইফ, ফাদার, মাদার দুটো ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজের মধ্যে এক্সিস্ট করছে. And all these words, amongst others, were common to the two languages. But such similarity is not found now, as both the languages have gradually differed from one another, having been subjected to the foreign influences. English to the French, Scandinavian to the Low German influences, many influence occurred, and hence these two languages become sometimes dissimilar. So, talking about the influences on the English vocabulary, the Scandinavians were by no means superior to the English, though not actually inferior in point of culture and civilization. And so the English did not feel any urge to borrow any particular type of words from them. As we all know that if a culture is much more superior or much more civilized, তখন সেই পার্টিকুলার কালচার থেকে অনেক বেশি শব্দ আর একটা কালচারে আসে, কারণ ন্যাচারালি সেই কালচারের এমন অনেক কিছু এক্সিস্ট করছে যেটা এই কালচারে করে না, ফলে সেই শব্দগুলোকে আনতে হয়. ফর এক্সাম্পল, ফ্রেঞ্চ থেকে প্রচুর লোন ওয়ার্ডস আফটার দ্য নরমান কনকোয়েস্ট ইংলিশে এসছে. সেম ইজ ট্রু ইন কেস অফ দ্য রোমান সেটেলার্স, প্রচুর ল্যাটিন ওয়ার্ড এসছে ইংলিশে. কিন্তু স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান ওয়ার্ড, স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান people, those who invaded the England, they were civilizationally not superior, and hence words like bound means ready, bask, boon, they are Norwegian basically. So these words were borrowed. So basically the influence of the Scandinavian conquest manifests itself in three directions. First, in certain place names and proper names. প্লেস নেম এবং প্রপার নেমে সব থেকে বেশি ইনফ্লুয়েন্স দেখা যায় স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ানে. সেকেন্ড, ইন দ্য ইন্ট্রোডাকশন অফ দ্য নিউ ওয়ার্ডস অফ দ্য ড্যানিশ অরিজিন, ওয়ার্ডস দোজ হু আর ড্যানিশ অরিজিন, অ্যান্ড সি ইন দ্য মডিফিকেশন ইন রেসপেক্ট অফ দ্য গ্রামার অ্যান্ড দ্য সিনট্যাক্স, সামটাইমস গ্রামার এবং সিনট্যাক্সে ইনফ্লুয়েন্স হিসেবে. সো লেট আস বিগিন উইথ দ্য স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান ইনফ্লুয়েন্স অফ দ্য প্লেস নেমস. Names, as I've already said, ends with by, thorpe, bake, dale, thwet, toft, etc. show the Scandinavian influence. Whitby, Goldthorpe, Braithwaite, Lowestoft, etc. Now all these suffixes have the meaning means village or hamlet. This preponderance of the Scandinavian place names shows that a great number of the Scandinavian families settled in England never to return. And quite a large number of place names are found also under the area of the Danelaw, like Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Cumberland, Westmoreland, Norfolk, etc. Personal names ends with son, like Gibson, Johnson, Ronson, Thompson. They are also Scandinavian in origin. Okay, so এইভাবে আমরা দেখতে পাই যে place names and various proper names were Scandinavian in origin. Now, Scandinavian influence in respect of the law terms and the war terms. Basically, Vikings were a war race. তারা বেসিক্যালি যুদ্ধের মাধ্যমে ল্যান্ডগুলো দখল করছিল, তারা যুদ্ধের মাধ্যমে জমি দখলের জন্য স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়া থেকে, নরওয়ে, সুইডেন, ডেনমার্ক থেকে এসেছিল ইংল্যান্ডে। ফলে ন্যাচারালি প্রচুর টার্ম দ্যাট অ্যাকচুয়ালি এন্ডস উইথ ল, বাই ল, থ্রল, ক্রেভ, রিলেটিং টু ওয়ার, স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান ভোক্যাবুলারি থেকে ইংলিশে বরোড হয়। সো as the Scandinavians were superior in land and the sea fight, the English borrowed from them a few words in this sphere, like orest. Orest means battle. Fylkir means to marshal. Leith means fleet. Barda, the kind of worship, etc. But these words soon disappeared. There were also various words relating to the architecture and cooking. They are not very superior in case of making good houses, but words like or good cuisines, but words like widow has been borrowed from Scandinavia origin, stick, knife, etc. And there were various obsolete native words revitalized through the Scandinavian influence. Sometimes some words which existed in the Old English but which had gone out of use gained back the vitality and currency through the Scandinavian influence, about Firero influence. These words, the preposition till, for instance, is found only in once or twice in the Old English, but right now it has been used. It's a Scandinavian influence, of course. Words like blend, ream, run, they were very rare in the Old English, but later their use was strengthened by the Scandinavian influence. And also, there are also collateral existence of the Old English and the Scandinavian forms of the same word with some slightly different shades of meaning. Coexistence হচ্ছে দুটো vocabulary, দুটো শব্দ একই রকমের দেখতে, একই রকমের মানে, কিন্তু একটু আলাদা। For example, whole Old English, the first word is English, the second is Scandinavian. For example, whole, hell, no, nay, from, fro, shirt, skirt, age, egg, shriek, screech, rear, raise. Now all these forms are used in standard speech. Now we will cite some cases where the Scandinavian forms survive in dialects native in the literary language. Dialect survive করেছে, native regional একটা survive করেছে, even leap, low, charge, kark is a dialect, ear, girth, mouth, mun, chest, kissed, dew, dag. So these were the dag, the girth, the kirk, they were Scandinavian language. And there were also cases where the native form has survived, Scandinavian form has disappeared. এরকমও জায়গা রয়েছে যেখানে নেটিভ ফর্মটা সার্ভাইভ করেছে কিন্তু স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান ফর্মটা ডিসঅ্যাপিয়ার করে গেছে থ্রু দ্য কোর্স অফ দ্য টাইম। অ্যাজ ফর এক্সাম্পল লোদ মিনস টু হেট সামওয়ান, ঘৃণা করা। ওল্ড ইংলিশ হ্যাজ আউস্টেড দ্য লেদ স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান। ফিউ দ্য ওল্ড ইংলিশ has ousted the foe Scandinavian. Fish, the Old English has ousted the fisk. Bench ousted the benk. Yearn, Old English ousted gurn. Naked, Old English has ousted naked. So these Scandinavian forms have disappeared from the English language. For example, Thanon, the Old English has ousted Thethin. So in fact, the origin of the Danes, hens, and where the Old English forms Danon, Henon, and Huanon as survived above have ousted the Scandinavian Diden, Heathen, and Huethen. And from these things, they actually became Danes, Hens, and Huens later by merging these two things. So, আমরা এবারে ডিসকাস করব অ্যাবাউট দ্য সেন্স শিফটিং, দ্যাট ইজ কেসেস হোয়ার নেটিভ ফর্ম হ্যাজ সার্ভাইভড বাট দ্য মিনিং অ্যাডপ্টেড ইজ দ্যাট অফ দ্য corresponding Scandinavian word, where the native word has survived, অর্থাৎ ওল্ড ইংলিশ ওয়ার্ড থেকে গেছে, কিন্তু যে মানেটা সে ক্যারি করছে বর্তমানে, the present meaning that the word is carrying becomes Scandinavian. So, for example, some old English words have retained their old native forms, but the meaning adopted is that of the old Scandinavian word. For example, the Old English word dream originally meant joy, but in the Middle English it assumed the modern meaning vision of the night, taken over from the Scandinavian Old Norse draumer or drom, which actually means the vision of the night. রাত্রিবেলা যে স্বপ্ন আমরা দেখি. Various analogous cases are the Old English braid meant fragment, টুকরো. The word has survived but adopted the Middle English modern meaning loaf, which has been taken from the meaning of the Danish broad. The Danish broad termটার মানে loaf, bread মানে ছিল fragment, bread broader মানটাকে ধারণ করেছে. Old English bloom meant mass of the metal. The word remains but adopted the Middle English modern sense. Shine taken over from the corresponding Scandinavian word. Dwell, Old English word meant to lead astray, ধ্বংস হয়ে যাওয়া, to lead astray. The word remains but adopted the modern meaning to remain in a place from the meaning of the corresponding Scandinavian word. Old English gift, for example, meant the price paid by a suitor in consideration of receiving a woman to wife. একজন suitor in consideration of receiving a woman to wife হিসেবে অ্যাকসেপ্ট করার জন্য একটা womanকে যে প্রাইস দেয়, but the modern meaning, which is general, not specific, has been taken over from the meaning of the Scandinavian word. The Old English Earl actually meant nobleman, but the modern meaning is something specific, nobleman ranking between the Marquis and Viscount. মাঝখানের যে র্যাঙ্ক সেটা Earl বলে, যেটা Old English Jarl, যেটা Old Norse, ওয়েন মানে Old Norse, Jarl থেকে নেওয়া হয়েছে. So these are some of the instances of the sense shifting, that is the meaning is shifting. Okay. Then there are also survival of the Scandinavian words due to the agreement with other native words. Some Scandinavian words have survived because they agreed so well with the other native words that they were readily associated with these native words and were felt better expressions for the ideas which they intended to convey than the Old English words which they ultimately ousted. Old English noun and adjective death and dead had corresponding Old English verbs. Steorfand and sweltern, আগেই বলেছি steorfand actually meant death. So Scandinavian verb was actually dea, that is die. This dea was more easily associated with the Old English to death and dead, probably because of the similarity of the initial sound in the Old English steorfand and sweltern, and thence they replace the steorfand and the sweltern and becomes death, dea. From the Scandinavian verb dea it becomes death. So dea was felt a fitter expression for the idea to die, and hence Scandinavian dea replaces the Old English verbs steorfand and sweltern and survives in the modern English as die. Similarly, Scandinavian want survived because of its agreement with the Old English wan, that is wanting, or wana means to want. Ill was retained because it agreed so well with the Old English evil. Evil এর সঙ্গে মিল খেয়ে illness তো এক ধরনের evil burden upon the humankind, যেন একটা খারাপ কেউ অভিশাপ দিয়েছে. So illness becomes actually retained because of its agreement with the evil. Sium, the Scandinavian sium survived because it was easily associated with the Old English sua, means so. So these are some of the example of the Scandinavian loan words. Now let us discuss about the Scandinavian influence on the various form words, various verbs and pronouns and prepositions, because I have already said that Scandinavian influence on the English grammar and vocabulary and syntax is to a great extent. And these words that made their way into English were not confined to nouns and adjectives and verbs, but extended to pronouns, prepositions, adverbs, and even a part of the verb to be. Pronouns like they, them, their, as has been already pointed out, are Scandinavian. So very basic foundational words আমরা প্রত্যেক দিনের ভোকাবুলারিতে ইউজ করি যে সমস্ত শব্দগুলো they, them, their were essentially Scandinavian in origin. But they are not only Scandinavian pronouns to be found in the English. Both and same, though not primarily pronouns, are prenominal uses and of Scandinavian origin. Prepositions, for example, the preposition till was at one time widely used in the sense of to, that is, besides having its present meaning, and fro, likewise in common use formerly as the equivalent of the from, use করা হতো, though. এগুলো প্রত্যেকটাই এই সমস্ত প্রিপোজিশনগুলো স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান ইন অরিজিন. অ্যাডভার্বস লাইক aloft, athwart, aye, and seemly in the earlier hethen means hence, and hoenthen means whens, are all derived from the Scandinavian origin. Verbs, the present plural are of the verb to be is a most significant adoption. So to be verb are Scandinavian. While we are on was the Old English from the north, the west section plural was seemed on, and the form are in modern English undoubtedly owes its extension to the influence of the Danes. So বোঝাই যাচ্ছে এইভাবে স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান ইনফ্লুয়েন্স ইংলিশ ভোকাবুলারিকে ভয়ঙ্করভাবে ইনফ্লুয়েন্স করেছে. ইউজ অফ দ্য প্রোনাউন্স, প্রিপোজিশনস, অ্যাডভার্বস, ভার্বস এটসেট্রা. সো আমরা স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান ইনফ্লুয়েন্সের হিস্টোরিক্যাল ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড আলোচনা করেছি. We have discussed about the concept of the Danelaw, we have discussed about the Viking invasions, and then we have discussed about the Scandinavian place names and how Scandinavian influence is rather a subterranean and domestic influence. It becomes a very domestic influence. It's difficult for a linguist to separate between the Scandinavian influence and the Old English influence. Now we will later read the French element into the English language, or French influence into the English language. But before that, let us differentiate between the Scandinavian and the French element. I have already said that the French influence upon the English language began around 1066 at the time of the Norman conquest. And French were superior people. They invaded the England from Normandy. They become the ruler of the land. At the same time, from 1066 onwards, French becomes the language of the administration. French becomes the language of the executive, the judiciary. But on the other hand, Scandinavian influence upon the English language is not on the administrative or official level, because they were not exactly the ruling class. They have settled in the eastern portion of London. The culture or civilization of the Scandinavian settlers cannot have been of a higher order than that of the English. So the difference between the two races cannot have been great, for the bulk of the Scandinavian words are of purely democratic character. This is clearly brought out by a comparison with the French words introduced in the following centuries. যে সমস্ত স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান ওয়ার্ড বড় হয়েছে ইংলিশে, দে ওয়ার অফ ডেমোক্রেটিক কোট আনকোট ক্যারেক্টার. ডেমোক্রেটিক মানে গণতান্ত্রিক, গণতান্ত্রিক মানে কোনো চাপিয়ে দেওয়া ব্যাপার নয়. আস্তে আস্তে দুটো জার্মানিক ট্রাইবসদের ভোকাবুলারির মধ্যে এই বিভিন্ন লোন ওয়ার্ডসের শব্দগুলো একে অপরের সঙ্গে মিশে গেছে. Thus, French represents the ruling, the rich, the refined, the aristocratic elements in the English nation. Perfume, words from the areas of the judiciary, words from the areas of the administration have been borrowed. While the Scandinavian words are much more homely expressions for things of everyday importance. They are democratic words. So remember, যেরকম প্রশ্ন পড়ে যে Scandinavian influence upon the English language is much more of a democratic character. So you have to write about the Scandinavian influence and have to give an elaborate introduction or a proper introduction, appropriate introduction, showing that how Scandinavian words are homely expressions. Few of the French words have gone into the speech of the people. They are used. used only by the upper classes. While the Scandinavian words have gone into the speech of the people, they're used by both the high and the low allied. So in this way we can say that truly that the Scandinavian influence is a homely influence, much more a homely influence than the French influence. French words are felt as foreign stocks on account of their length. The shortness of the Scandinavian words agrees with the monosyllabic character of the native words. Consequently, they are felt far less as foreign elements. এটাই বারবার বলছিলাম যে Scandinavian influence upon the English language এতটাই domestic, এতটাই democratic in character that they consequently are felt to be far less as foreign elements into the English language. They gradually got absorbed in the English vocabulary. French words represent high intellectual or emotional subjects or fashionable matters, while Scandinavian words represent daily conversational matters in our daily life. And quote Otto Jespersen, in fact, in many statistical calculations of the proportion of the native to imported words in English, Scandinavian words have been more or less inadvertently included in the native elements. Hence, Otto Jespersen says that an Englishman cannot thrive or be ill or die without the Scandinavian. An Englishman, a truly British man, cannot thrive or be ill, জীবনে বাঁচতে পারবে না, অসুস্থ হতে পারবে না, অথবা মৃত্যুও বরণ করতে পারবে না স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান শব্দ ছাড়া। They are to the language what bread and eggs are to the daily affair. যেরকমভাবে রুটি এবং ডিম প্রত্যেক দিনের আমাদের জীবনের পার্ট, মানে ব্রিটিশ লাইফের পার্ট, সেরকমভাবে স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজও পার্ট অ্যান্ড পার্সেল অফ দ্য ডেইলি লাইফ অফ আ ব্রিটিশার। So in this way we can say that words like bread, eggs, indispensable words like father, mother, can, come, seat, which are daily are being used daily in our life, from day-to-day life, are Scandinavian in origin. So Jespersen, Otto Jespersen's statement, the growth and development of the English language, in his famous book he said these words. So Jespersen's quoted statement above should not be taken only in the literal sense. What he wanted to mean is the pervasive influence which the Scandinavian words had on the language of the Englishmen, who have to use quite a substantial amount of Scandinavian words in their daily use. So one British person had to use quite a substantial number of the Scandinavian words in their daily use. The domestic and democratic character of the English language has been largely influenced by the infiltration of the common Scandinavian words into the English vocabulary, like the words knife, window, sister, give, gate, take, one, sky, same, they, there, etc. So this is the Scandinavian influence upon the English language. So truly speaking, in this lecture I have discussed about the geographical location of Scandinavia, where the Scandinavia is. Scandinavia is located in the north of the Europe. It is consisted of 3 nations, Norway, Sweden and Denmark. Many geographers also include Finland. This is Finland. Denmarkটা এই ছোট্ট জায়গাটা। So talking about the historical influence, historical background of the Scandinavian people, they were known as Vikings or pirates, বাংলায় জলদস্যু. So this particular period is known as the Viking Age. They were also Germanic tribes of the Scandinavian Peninsula, just like the Anglo-Saxons. They invaded Britain and settled in Britain in the late 8th century, around 790. They invaded the Britain and they were finally stopped by the King Alfred of Wessex. He signed with them the Treaty of Wedmore in 878 OD with Gunthrum, the Viking leader, and later they settled in a certain part of England. This particular part where the Danish law will be prevailed is known as Danelaw. And from around 8th century, the Scandinavian influence on the English language began. As I have already said, that the Scandinavian influence upon the English language is domestic and democratic in nature, because they were not superior people, they were rather inferior people comparing with the French and other influences or Latin influences, that is Roman influences upon the English language. Various place names, talking about the borrowings, the loan words from the Scandinavian into the English language. Scandinavian place names, almost more than 600 place names have been borrowed from Scandinavian origin. There many pronouns, very basic words like them, there, basic nouns like bank, band, birth, boon, brink, bull, calf, drake, the egg, the gate, husband. They were Scandinavian in origin. Adjectives like awkward, flat, ill, loose, low, meek, muggy, scant. Verbs like bait, bask, batten, cal, cast, cow. Cow is of course a noun. Scare, thrust. So these words have been borrowed from the Scandinavian language, and as Otto E. S. Pearson said, that the Englishman cannot even thrive, die, or ill or die without the Scandinavian word. So they are part and parcel of the English vocabulary. So thank you for listening to this lecture. In the next lecture, we will talk about the French influence on the English language. So I've already done with the Latin influence and the Scandinavian influence, and of course I have taught you the gender discrimination, the outgrowing gender bias in the English language. I have discussed with you about the standardization of the English language and the semantic shift into the English language. In the next lecture, we'll move into the French influence of the into the English language. Thank you. Bye. See you in the next lecture.